What if the most feared occult book in history never actually existed? What if scholars, magicians, and horror fans have been searching libraries worldwide for nearly a century for something that came from one man's imagination? By the end of this video, you'll discover how a fictional grimoire became more terrifying than any real ancient text, and why neuroscience proves your brain literally cannot tell the difference. Welcome, seeker of forbidden truths. I'm about to reveal the most extraordinary literary deception ever pulled off. One so convincing that even today, people refuse to believe it's fake. But here's the question that will haunt you. If something fictional can develop this much power over reality, what does that tell us about the nature of reality itself? Before we dive into this rabbit hole, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard of the Necronomicon? Drop a comment right now. Right? I know it, if you've heard of it. Or first time, if this is new to you. I read every single comment, and I'm curious how deep this mystery has reached into your consciousness. Today, we're exploring 4 mind-bending chapters of this story. First, how a lonely writer in 1920s, Providence accidentally created the world's most convincing fake grimoire. Then how fiction literally transformed into reality before our eyes. Third, how it conquered popular culture and rewired millions of minds. And finally, what cutting-edge neuroscience reveals about why forbidden knowledge triggers such powerful responses in human consciousness. Trust me, by the end, you'll question everything you think you know about what's real and what's fiction. Close your eyes and picture this. Providence, Rhode Island, 1922. Gas lamps flicker through foggy streets as a sickly, reclusive figure walks alone through the night. The air carries that damp chill that seeps into your bones, mixing with the scent of old books and dying leaves. This is Howard Phillips Lovecraft's world. A place where reality feels thin, where ancient shadows seem to move just beyond the edge of vision. Inside his cramped apartment on Angel Street, Lovecraft sits at his wooden desk in the early morning hours. The only sounds are the scratch of his pen and the distant whistle of trains carrying people to lives he'll never live. He's not just writing horror stories. He's about to perform an act of accidental magic that will outlive him by centuries and fool some of the most brilliant minds in history. You see, when Lovecraft first mentioned the Necronomicon in his story, The Hound, he wasn't trying to deceive anyone. He was simply doing what every masterful horror writer understands, making the impossible feel not just possible, but inevitable. But this time, something different happened. Something that would prove the terrifying power of human imagination. But here's where most people get the story completely wrong. They think Lovecraft just invented a scary book title and moved on. The truth is far more fascinating and reveals something profound about the hidden mechanics of belief itself. Lovecraft possessed an almost supernatural understanding of how to make fiction feel like historical fact. He was a master of what scholars now call pseudo-authenticity, the art of making lies feel more truthful than true. The name itself carries layers of meaning that most people never discover. Necronomicon, constructed from ancient Greek roots, nekros meaning dead, nomos meaning law or custom, and eikon meaning image. The Book of Dead Laws, or image of the law of the dead. Say it slowly. Necronomicon. Can you feel how it seems to echo from some forgotten library vault? How it carries the weight of centuries, even though it was born in a 20th century mind. But Lovecraft's genius went deeper than clever linguistics. He understood that the most convincing lies are built on foundations of meticulous detail. So he began constructing an elaborate fictional history that was so precisely crafted, so thoroughly researched sounding, that it would fool university librarians, occult scholars, and antiquarian book dealers for decades to come. Imagine yourself back in that Providence apartment. The year is 1922, and the world is still reeling from the Great War. Spiritualism is exploding across America as grieving families desperately seek contact with their dead. Secret societies like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn are attracting intellectuals hungry for hidden wisdom. The boundaries between science and mysticism are blurring as never before. Into this atmosphere of spiritual hunger and occult fascination, Lovecraft dropped his masterpiece of fictional authenticity, according to his carefully constructed documentation. The original title was Al-Azif, and here's where your skin should start to crawl. Azif was the word ancient Arabs used to describe the eerie nocturnal sounds made by insects. Sounds they believed were actually demons howling in the darkness between worlds. Stop for a moment. Close your eyes and listen. Can you hear that subtle buzzing that seems to come from nowhere when you're alone at night? That almost musical hum that makes the hair on your arms stand up? According to Arab folklore, that's not insects. That's the sound of entities from other dimensions trying to break through into ours. Lovecraft chose this word deliberately. He wanted his fictional grimoire to carry the psychic residue of genuine ancient fear. But Lovecraft's stroke of genius wasn't just in the name. It was in the character he created to write this impossible book. And when you learn the truth about Abdul al-Hazard, you'll understand why this literary hoax was so devastatingly convincing. Abdul al-Hazard, the mad Arab of Damascus. The name rolls off your tongue like an incantation, doesn't it? It feels ancient, weathered by centuries of whispered tellings. But here's what they don't teach you in literature classes. What most Lovecraft scholars miss entirely. Abdul al-Hazard wasn't just some random character Lovecraft invented for dramatic effect. This name carried deep personal significance. It was actually a childhood nickname that Lovecraft's uncle gave him when young Howard became completely obsessed with the Arabian Nights. Picture a sickly, bookish child so lost in tales of jinn and desert mysteries that his own family began calling him by an Arabic name. Think about the psychological layers here. Lovecraft was literally writing himself into his own mythology. He was creating a fictional author who was, in the strangest possible way, a reflection of his own obsession with forbidden knowledge and ancient mysteries. The mad Arab wasn't just a character. He was Lovecraft's shadow self, his alter ego exploring territories of imagination that his conscious mind could barely comprehend. According to the fictional biography Lovecraft, crafted with scholarly precision, Abdul al-Hazard spent 10 years alone in the great southern desert of Arabia, the Rabba el-Haliyeh, the dreaded empty space of the ancients. Imagine this mad poet wandering through landscapes so desolate they seem to exist outside normal reality. Picture him exploring the crumbling ruins of Babylon, descending into the underground chambers beneath Memphis, discovering secrets so terrible they shattered his sanity completely. The biographical details read like genuine historical documentation. Born in Sana'a, Yemen, around 700 AD during the early Islamic expansion, traveled throughout the ancient world, from the libraries of Alexandria to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, wrote the original Al-Asif in Damascus around 730 AD, pouring decades of forbidden discoveries onto parchment with ink mixed from substances better left unnamed. And his death, even his death, was crafted to add authenticity. According to Lovecraft's account, Abdul al-Hazard met his end in broad daylight in the busy marketplace of Damascus, torn apart by invisible demons while horrified witnesses watched helplessly. No corpse was ever found, only bloodstains on the sand that seemed to form symbols no human language could decipher. Now pause for a moment. As I'm telling you this story, can you feel how real it sounds? How detailed and convincing these historical facts are? Your brain is processing this information the same way it would process genuine historical accounts. Right? It feels real in the comments if you're experiencing that sensation of believability. This is exactly what happened to readers, scholars, and seekers for nearly a century. But here's what's really happening on a neurological level. Modern brain science reveals that when we encounter detailed, emotionally engaging stories, our minds activate the same neural pathways used for processing actual memories. The line between experienced and imagined becomes dangerously thin. Lovecraft intuitively understood something that neuroscientists wouldn't prove decades later. The human brain is fundamentally a story processing machine. We don't just tell stories, we are stories. And the most powerful stories aren't just entertainment. They become part of our psychological reality, regardless of their factual basis. And in 1927, Lovecraft did something that would seal the fate of his fictional creation forever and blur the line between imagination and reality beyond any possibility of return. He wrote what appeared to be a genuine scholarly work called History of the Necronomicon. Not a story, not fiction, a dry academic historical document complete with publication dates, translation details, and the tragic fate of various editions throughout history. And with this single act of literary alchemy, he was about to transform imagination into something far more dangerous. What I'm about to tell you sounds impossible, but I have documentation to prove every. Picture Lovecraft in 1927, sitting at that same wooden desk where he birthed the Necronomicon 5 years earlier. The gas lamps have been replaced by electric bulbs, but the atmosphere of mystery remains thick in his cramped Providence apartment. He's not writing fiction this time. He's creating what would become the most convincing piece of literary fraud in human history. The document he produced was titled simply History of the Necronomicon. 24 paragraphs of dry scholarly prose that read exactly like something you'd find in a university library's rare manuscripts collection. This wasn't written for publication. It wasn't even written for other people. Lovecraft created this detailed bibliography purely for his own reference, to keep his fictional citations consistent across different stories. But accidentally, without any intention of deception, he had just forged a master key that would unlock the door between imagination and accepted reality. Listen to how convincing this sounds. According to Lovecraft's documentation, the Greek translation was completed by Theodorus Philetus in Constantinople in 950 AD during the height of Byzantine scholarship. The Latin translation, which gave us the familiar title Necronomicon, appeared in the 13th century through the work of Olaus Wormius, a name that carries just enough historical plausibility to fool casual research. Each historical detail was crafted with microscopic precision. The book was supposedly condemned and banned by Pope Gregory IX in 1232. Copies were burned in public squares across Europe. Secret editions were hidden in the private collections of alchemists and forbidden knowledge seekers. The Spanish Inquisition specifically targeted any suspected copies for destruction. Can you see the psychological brilliance here? Every persecution, every prohibition, every act of suppression only made the Necronomicon seem more real, more dangerous, more urgently desirable. Lovecraft was accidentally implementing what modern marketers call scarcity psychology, the principle that banned knowledge becomes infinitely more valuable than freely available information. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody, not even Lovecraft himself, could have predicted or imagined. After Lovecraft died in poverty and obscurity in 1937, something extraordinary began happening across America and beyond. People started actively searching for the Necronomicon, not as a literary exercise, not as an academic curiosity. They genuinely, desperately believed it existed somewhere in the world, waiting to be discovered. Picture this scene, repeated thousands of times across the country. A serious-faced graduate student approaches the reference desk at Yale's Sterling Memorial Library. "Excuse me," they whisper. "I'm looking for any copies of the Necronomicon." "I understand you might have it in the restricted collection?" The librarian's expression shifts from helpful to confused to slightly alarmed. "The what?" "I'm sorry. I'm not familiar with that title." But the seeker persists. They have documentation. They have publication details. They have the complete bibliographic history that Lovecraft crafted with such meticulous care. The student shows the librarian photocopied pages from history of the Necronomicon, pointing to specific dates, specific editions, specific translations. The librarian checks the catalog. Nothing. Checks interlibrary systems. Nothing. Contacts colleagues at Harvard, Columbia, the British Library. Still nothing. But the requests keep coming, week after week, from different people carrying the same mysterious bibliography. This scene played out at universities across America throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Librarians began to recognize the title and would patiently explain that the book didn't exist, that it was fictional, created by a horror writer. But many seekers refused to believe this explanation. After all, they had documentation. They had scholarly references. How could something so thoroughly documented simply not exist? The fictional had begun its metamorphosis into the factual, and the transformation was accelerating. When History of the Necronomicon was finally published in 1938 by Rebel Press, in a tiny print run of approximately 80 copies, something unprecedented occurred in the history of literature. A fictional bibliography of a fictional book became a genuine collector's item, selling for real money to real people who treated it as authentic historical documentation. Think about the metaphysical implications here. Fiction was literally consuming reality, transforming imagination into commodity, dream into desire. But the most shocking development came during the counterculture explosion of the 1960s and early 70s, as America's spiritual landscape shifted toward Eastern mysticism, alternative consciousness, and hidden knowledge traditions. the hunger for forbidden wisdom reached fever pitch. Young seekers, disillusioned with mainstream religion and conventional reality, began actively searching antiquarian bookshops, estate sales, and private collections for any trace of the legendary grimoire. Entrepreneurs with sharp psychological insight began to recognize something incredible. There was massive, untapped demand for a book that didn't exist. The market had created itself. Supply was about to meet demand in the most unexpected way possible. And then it happened. Stop for a moment and consider this carefully. Have you ever wanted something more desperately because you were told you couldn't have it? Right, forbidden tower. If you understand this fundamental quirk of human psychology, because what happened next demonstrates this principle on a massive cultural scale. The most famous case emerged in the mid-1970s with what became known as the Simon Necronomicon. Simon, a mysterious pseudonym that added layers of intrigue and authenticity. But this wasn't some amateur publishing scam or quick cash grab. This was a sophisticated operation that understood exactly what spiritual seekers were craving and possessed the occult knowledge to deliver it convincingly. The Simon Necronomicon was based on genuine Sumerian mythology, ancient Mesopotamian religious practices, and elaborate magical rituals drawn from authentic historical sources. It had nothing whatsoever to do with Lovecraft's original fictional creation, but that disconnect didn't matter. It felt ancient. It felt dangerous. It felt like the real thing that scholars and authorities have been trying to hide from public knowledge. Picture yourself walking into one of those dimly lit occult bookshops that flourished in 1970s, New York or San Francisco. Incense smoke curls through the air, mixing sandalwood with something darker, more primal. Shelves lined with volumes on astrology, tarot, witchcraft, and Eastern mysticism create shadowy corridors of forbidden knowledge. And there, behind the counter in a locked glass case, you see it. A leather-bound volume with strange symbols etched into the cover. The proprietor notices your interest and leans forward conspiratorially. That's one of only 666 copies, they whisper. First edition. The publisher limited the run for obvious reasons. Your heart starts racing. Your palms get damp. Every rational part of your mind knows this is marketing theater, but something deeper, more primal, responds to the promise of authentic, forbidden knowledge. The Simon Necronomicon was released in multiple calculated waves designed to maximize psychological impact. First came the expensive leather-bound edition, limited to exactly 666 copies, a number chosen for its obvious occult significance. The scarcity was artificial, but effective. Collectors and practitioners competed to acquire copies, driving prices far beyond rational book value. Then came the second wave, 3,333 copies in a slightly less expensive binding. Again, the numerology was deliberate. 3,333, reducing to the mystical number 9, suggesting completion and spiritual transformation. The marketing genius lay not just in understanding scarcity psychology, but in appealing to the occult practitioners' trained sensitivity to symbolic meaning. But here's the part that reveals the most disturbing truth about human consciousness and belief. Many people who purchased these books genuinely convinced themselves they were acquiring the real Necronomicon. Despite clear copyright notices, despite obvious modern typography, despite the complete impossibility of the situation. Belief had overwhelmed logic so completely that reality itself became negotiable. The demand had literally created the supply. Fiction had birthed physical reality. A book that never existed was now sitting on thousands of bookshelves worldwide, being studied, practiced, feared, and revered as authentic ancient wisdom. But this raises the most profound question of all. If something completely fictional can develop this kind of measurable power over human consciousness, what does that reveal about the fundamental nature of everything else we consider real? What I'm about to share demonstrates how a single fictional concept can infiltrate and reshape entire cultural landscapes, influencing art, music, film, and ultimately, the collective unconscious of millions of people worldwide. The Necronomicon's cultural conquest began in the underground, but quickly spread to mainstream consciousness through vectors that Lovecraft could never have anticipated. By the 1960s, his creation had achieved something that genuine ancient texts rarely manage. It had become genuinely feared, universally recognized, and culturally inevitable. Let me take you on a journey through the Necronomicon's cultural invasion. Picture the smoky clubs of 1960s London, where young musicians, hungry for darker inspirations, discovered Lovecraft's cosmic horrors. Black Sabbath, the godfathers of heavy metal, began weaving Necronomicon references into their lyrics and stage performances. Tony Iommi's guitar riffs seemed to channel the same otherworldly dread that Lovecraft had captured in prose. But it didn't stop there. The influence spread like a virus through heavy metal's DNA. Metallica recorded tracks inspired by Lovecraft's mythology. Morbid Angel named themselves after concepts from the Fictional Grimoire. Iron Maiden crafted elaborate stage shows around Cthulhu mythos themes. Thousands of underground metal bands adopted the Necronomicon as a kind of musical scripture, using its imagery and concepts to explore territories of sound that conventional music couldn't access. Think about what was happening here. Musicians were translating fictional occult concepts into sonic experiences that audiences could feel in their bodies. The Necronomicon wasn't just being read anymore. It was being heard, felt, experienced through rhythm and vibration that bypassed rational thought and went straight into the nervous system. The visual media conquest was even more dramatic and psychologically powerful. Sam Raimi's Evil Dead franchise transformed the Necronomicon from literary concept into visceral cinematic experience. Audiences watched characters discover the dreaded book, speak its forbidden words, and unleash cosmic horrors into physical reality. The Book of the Dead became a visual icon recognizable to millions who had never read a single Lovecraft story. Horror filmmakers understood something profound about the Necronomicon's psychological power. It served as the perfect MacGuffin, the mysterious object that drives narrative tension while representing humanity's dangerous relationship with forbidden knowledge. Movies like In the Mouth of Madness, The Dunwich Horror, and dozens of independent horror films used Necronomicon imagery to trigger primal fears in audiences worldwide. But here's where it gets truly fascinating from a consciousness perspective. These visual representations were literally programming millions of minds with specific imagery, symbols, and emotional associations. People who had never heard of H.P. Lovecraft were developing conditioned responses to tentacled creatures, ancient tomes, and cosmic horror concepts that originated in one man's imagination. The gaming industry's adoption of Necronomicon mythology created an entirely new level of psychological immersion. Call of Cthulhu role-playing games allowed participants to actively inhabit Lovecraft's universe, making decisions and experiencing consequences within the cosmic horror framework. Players weren't just reading about or watching the Necronomicon's influence. They were participating in its reality. Video games like Eternal Darkness, the Doom series, and countless indie horror games incorporated Necronomicon elements as core gameplay mechanics. Players would discover forbidden tomes, learn dangerous spells, and watch their characters' sanity deteriorate from exposure to cosmic truths. The line between player and character, between fiction and psychological experience, began to blur in unprecedented ways. Have you ever played a game or watched a movie that referenced the Necronomicon? Write just a ST in the comments if you've encountered it in popular culture. I'm curious to see how far this fictional creation has penetrated into your personal media experiences. The internet age transformed the Necronomicon from cultural reference into living meme, a self-replicating idea that spreads through digital networks and embeds itself in collective consciousness. Websites claim to offer real passages from the book. Online forums debated its authenticity. Digital artists created visualizations of its pages. The Fictional Grimoire achieved a form of distributed existence across millions of connected minds. Social media amplified this effect exponentially. Memes featuring Necronomicon imagery spread across platforms, often stripped of their original context, but carrying the emotional and symbolic payload that Lovecraft had encoded decades earlier. Young people who had never heard of Lovecraft were sharing, liking, and commenting on content derived from his imagination. The most remarkable development was the emergence of Necronomicon challenges on various platforms. Users attempting to create their own versions, sharing found pages, or claiming to have discovered authentic copies. Fiction was generating more fiction in an endless feedback loop of creative expansion. What we're witnessing here is something unprecedented in human cultural history. The transformation of a purely fictional concept into a genuine cultural archetype. The Necronomicon has achieved what mythologist Joseph Campbell called archetypal status. It has become a universal symbol that transcends its original context and speaks to fundamental patterns in human consciousness. Carl Jung would have been fascinated by this phenomenon. The Necronomicon operates as what he called a complex, an emotionally charged cluster of ideas that exists semi-independently within the psyche. For millions of people, the mention of this fictional book triggers immediate associations with forbidden knowledge, cosmic horror, and the dangerous allure of hidden truths. But here's the deeper psychological truth. The Necronomicon's cultural power doesn't derive from its fictional content. It derives from its perfect embodiment of humanity's conflicted relationship with knowledge itself. We simultaneously crave and fear ultimate understanding. We're drawn to secrets while terrified of their consequences. The Necronomicon crystallizes this fundamental psychological tension into a single powerful symbol. And this brings us to the most profound realization of all. The Necronomicon's conquest of popular culture reveals something shocking about the nature of reality itself. If a completely fictional creation can achieve this level of influence over millions of minds, reshape entire artistic movements, and embed itself permanently in collective consciousness, what does that tell us about the difference between real and imaginary? What does cutting-edge neuroscience reveal about why your brain literally cannot distinguish between vividly imagined experiences and actual memories? And how does this explain why forbidden knowledge triggers such powerful responses in human consciousness? What I'm about to share is not taught in any mainstream institution, but represents the cutting edge of consciousness research and reveals why the Necronomicon phenomenon demonstrates fundamental truths about how reality is constructed in human awareness. Modern neuroscience has made discoveries that would have seemed like science fiction just decades ago. Discoveries that explain exactly why fictional creations like the Necronomicon can achieve such profound psychological power. And here's what happens in your brain when you encounter forbidden knowledge. The moment you read or hear about something described as secret, hidden, or prohibited, your neurological systems activate in specific, measurable ways. The dopamine pathways that normally respond to food, sex, or other survival-related rewards suddenly spike with anticipation. Your brain literally treats forbidden information as a form of neurochemical treasure. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research at Stanford University demonstrates that the brain's reward system becomes hyperactive when presented with information that's scarce, difficult to obtain, or socially restricted. The Necronomicon phenomenon perfectly exploits this neurological vulnerability by presenting itself as dangerous, banned, and hidden knowledge. It triggers the same dopamine cascades that make gambling, drugs, or other addictive behaviors so compelling. But the neurological effects go deeper than simple reward chemistry. When you read detailed descriptions of the Necronomicon, its leather binding, ancient symbols, forbidden contents, your brain activates regions associated with actual memory formation. The hippocampus, which processes and stores experiential memories, responds to vivid fictional descriptions the same way it responds to real sensory input. Your consciousness is literally creating memories of experiences you've never had with objects that don't exist. The most shocking discovery from recent consciousness research is what neuroscientists call source monitoring errors. Your brain's inability to distinguish between information acquired through direct experience versus Think about this carefully. Right now, as I describe the Necronomicon's weathered pages and strange symbols, your brain is creating neural pathways that are functionally identical to memories of actually seeing those pages. The difference between remembered and imagined exists only at the conscious, rational level. Below that, in the deeper structures of mind, they're processed as the same type of information. This explains why so many people throughout history have become convinced of the Necronomicon's reality, despite clear evidence of its fictional origins. Their brains have genuinely stored detailed memories of learning about this book, reading about its history, encountering references in multiple sources. The neurological foundation for belief has been established through repetitive exposure to consistent fictional detail. Have you ever had the experience of remembering something so vividly that you're shocked to discover it never actually happened? Or feeling like you've been to a place you've only seen in movies or read about in books? Right memory confusion, if you've experienced this phenomenon. You're witnessing your own brain's inability to distinguish between different types of information input. Ancient Tibetan Buddhist psychology includes concepts that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Tulpas, or thought forms, mental constructs that achieve semi-independent existence through focused attention and sustained visualization. What the Tibetans discovered through meditative practice, we're now confirming through brain imaging and consciousness research. The Necronomicon has become literature's most successful tulpa. Through the focused attention of millions of minds over decades, it has achieved a form of psychological existence that transcends its fictional origins. It exists now in the collective unconscious, influencing thoughts, dreams, creative works, and cultural expressions regardless of its lack of physical reality. Carl Jung's concept of archetypes provides another framework for understanding this phenomenon. The Necronomicon has tapped into what Jung called the shadow archetype, humanity's collective repository of repressed knowledge, forbidden desires, and dangerous wisdom. By embodying these archetypal energies in symbolic form, Lovecraft accidentally created a key that unlocks deep psychological territories in anyone who encounters it. Modern chaos magicians understand these principles explicitly. They work with egregores, group mind entities created through collective belief and sustained attention. The Necronomicon functions as a literary egregore, feeding on the psychic energy of everyone who reads about it, thinks about it, fears it, or desires. This brings us to the most profound implications of the Necronomicon phenomena. It demonstrates that consciousness plays a far more active role in constructing reality than mainstream Western thought acknowledges. Quantum physics suggests that observation affects physical reality at the most fundamental level. Consciousness research indicates that attention and belief shape psychological reality in measurable ways. The Necronomicon represents a perfect case study in how these principles operate on a cultural scale. Every time someone reads about the Necronomicon, searches for it, discusses it, or creates art inspired by it, they are participating in its ongoing manifestation. The fictional has achieved a form of consensus reality through the accumulated attention of millions of minds. This is not metaphorical. It's a literal description of how ideas achieve independent existence in human culture. Understanding the Necronomicon phenomenon has practical implications for how we approach all forms of information, belief, and reality construction. If your brain cannot reliably distinguish between vividly imagined and actually experienced, then the stories you tell yourself, the media you consume, and the ideas you repeatedly focus on are literally shaping your neurological reality. This is why ancient wisdom traditions placed such emphasis on controlling attention and being discriminating about what information you allow into consciousness. They understood intuitively what neuroscience now proves. Your mind is constantly creating reality through the processes of attention, belief, and imaginative engagement. The Necronomicon succeeded where countless genuine ancient texts failed because it was built on psychological truth rather than historical fact. It perfectly embodied humanity's relationship with forbidden knowledge, cosmic mystery, and the dangerous allure of hidden wisdom. Its fictional status became irrelevant because its psychological authenticity was absolute. What we've discovered through this journey is that the boundary between real and fictional is far more fluid than conventional thinking suggests. The Necronomicon exists, not as a physical book, but as a living component of human culture and consciousness. It influences behavior, inspires creativity, generates fear and fascination, and continues to shape millions of minds decades after its creation. This reveals something profound about the nature of reality itself. Consciousness doesn't just passively observe reality. It actively participates in its ongoing creation. The stories we believe, the symbols we empower with attention, and the ideas we collectively sustain all contribute to the reality we jointly inhabit. The real Necronomicon was never a book. It was always the creative power of imagination itself, that infinite library of possibility that exists within consciousness, containing every story that ever was or ever could be. Lovecraft didn't create the Necronomicon so much as he discovered it, existing eternally in the realm of potential, waiting for the right consciousness to give it form. You now possess knowledge that changes everything. You understand how fiction becomes reality, how imagination shapes physical culture, and why your brain treats vivid stories as genuine memories. The question isn't whether the Necronomicon is real. The question is what you'll create with the same reality-shaping power that brought it into existence. If you've felt the truth resonating through these words, if you've glimpsed the malleable nature of reality itself, write "The veil is lifting" in the comments below. Share your own experiences with the creative power of imagination, because every story of conscious creation adds to our collective understanding of what's possible. And if you're brave enough to explore more forbidden truths about consciousness, reality, and the hidden forces that shape our world, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. The ancient mysteries are revealing themselves to those courageous enough to seek them. Until we meet again in the spaces between worlds, remember this: today's fiction is tomorrow's reality. For those who understand the true creative power of consciousness itself, the Necronomicon proved it beyond any doubt. Now, what impossible thing will you make real? Before this knowledge fades into the background noise of your daily life, take immediate action. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're building a community of consciousness explorers who understand these hidden mechanics of reality. Hit that notification bell so you never miss new revelations. And most importantly, write in the comments what you plan to create with this understanding of how imagination becomes reality. Because consciousness without focused action remains just potential, and the universe is waiting to see what impossible things you'll bootstrap into existence, using the same principles that transformed Lovecraft's dream into cultural reality. The forbidden knowledge is yours now. Use it wisely.